part of these survivors, the bloodlines, if you like, genetics of people who had lived through a planet which had a much denser atmosphere. And I think this kind of science and research is going to give us a much better clue as to who these people were and where they came from.
Yes.
And I think that common sense tells us that it's far more likely that they would have been from this planet than any other planet.
And this is really fascinating, because what you're saying here is that the circumstances of was potentially so different on Earth back then. We had a more lush planet, more oxygen in the atmosphere, as you said, and so we might have ending up here with a small fraction of people that are the original inhabitants of this planet. Very few survived this. And of course, what immediately arises here is two different branches, so to speak, of the story. One is that we have this kind of biblical narrative of this, also, of course, of the giants or the Nephilim, as some call them. They have been called the shining ones as well in other circles, and that's one factor that we can take into account here. And then the other account is, of course, where do we come from in all of this? Because if we weren't around back then, but we were around early enough, so to speak, in order to write about them, and these people that are still were left. So tell us a little bit about this and what you think here happened.
Well, I'm very influenced by our geneticists, and I'm hoping that Mark Thomas, who's one of the people I most respect on genetic work, who's based at UCL, I'm hoping he's going to come and talk to us at our Stars and Stones Winter Forum in November the 16th, and 15th and 16th, and give us his views on this genetic record, because it's very, very important. The one thing I think is very clear, and that is that whether you're black or whether you're white or whether you're Chinese, everybody on the planet has a common Y chromosome dated back to 50,000 BC. It's very important. We're very recent, very new species, and we're very closely related. And there are reasons for this, I think, which I can come back to later and go into this in more detail. But I think that the geneticists will be able to put many people's mind at rest as to where these people came from, whether we have literally alien blood or not. As things stand at the moment, we are very unique, we're very new, and we're all very, very similar, and we also have very similar brain sizes. What we do with our brains may be a different matter, but many people now are producing wonderful work in letting children play music at a very early age, letting children do a lot of mathematics at a very early age. And we're finding that we can get terrific performances from individuals if we approach our education in a different way than the one we've done it before.
Yes.
And the other issue is that all of us have these latent practical skills. 100 years ago, we would have been doing twice or three times the amount of physical work we do now. And we would have been far more practical people, fending for ourselves, feeding our families, making our own homes, doing all kind of things which were quite different to being put in a sort of urban box as people are now, expected to perform in a particular way. And this is giving society a whole range of very serious and difficult problems. And this is one of the major areas I think that we can look at and compare with our ancestors who recognized that we needed a role society. We needed to be able to train people to do specific jobs and train them very well. So if we take the city of Mari, which was a very good example of one of the great early cities before 2500, there were over 200 trade guilds with people being craftsmen in each of those 200 trade guilds. We see the tradition still surviving amongst the Druids of people having to spend 20 years of training before they become a master craftsman or reaching certain qualifications. So that every member of the community, the administrators, the policymakers, the leaders, were all extremely well equipped and extremely well trained to look after the community as a whole.
And this was a necessity for survival, correct?
Exactly. If you can imagine what it would have been like for you and I back at that time, and we'd been one of the 7, and we'd been looking at a world completely crumpled and buckled, and damaged, and everything lost, we would have had to say, how the heck do we get everything straight?
Yeah.
And you have the story of and Enlil and Ninkarsag and Enki and the other archangels and the angels and the watchers. The watchers were the 3rd order of craftsmen, and they were represented on the Anunnaki or Anunnaki Council. O'Brien prefers the word Anunnaki as a correct translation of that, but it matters little either way. But what we have is very clearly 3 layers. The archangels were the 2-eyed serpents, because serpent had nothing to do with snakes whatsoever then. It meant wise person.
Right.
And the archangels were 2-eyed serpents. The angels were 1-eyed serpents. In other words, if you had 2 eyes open, then you were actually intelligent and doing your job well, and you were less well qualified if you were a 1-eyed serpent. And if you were a watcher, then you were also on the same kind of regulatory system, keeping your eyes open. It's as simple as that.
Do you think that this was a literal thing, or was this just a symbolic way of relaying this kind of information? What do you think?
These are the words that come down to us, and the Druids would always say, "We are the Druids, we are the serpents." And the word serpent, the roots, O'Brien goes into great detail with the roots of these key words and shows that all the basic roots, SRP and SRB, the 2 or 3 roots here, the basic word of serpent, they all relate to surveyors and medical qualifications and skills, and people who are wise and sensible and extremely well qualified.
Yes.
It's only much later that the word serpent is turned into one of the words for snake. And that is a denigration of the old order, and it's quite a recent denigration.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have is a whole load of snake or serpent cults springing up, which are there simply to tell everybody that the old order, our wonderful ancestors, were awful people. And so we get a great conspiracy theory, and unfortunately, this seems to proliferate in so many different areas.
Well,
but that's my view. It's other people to make up their own minds. But you can understand, even if you look at children and children's interpretation of our Bible over a very short time span. There were a lovely story of children were asked about various things on the Bible, and one said that the epistles were the wives of the apostles. One child said that Mary had an immaculate contraption, and another child said that Lot's wife was a pillar of salt by day and a ball of fire by night.
That's wonderful.
That just illustrates very simply how we have misused and misunderstood our language. And over my lifetime, so many words come through, and I come right back to O'Brien again. O'Brien uses the word alien, but he's talking about people moving into an area which they didn't exist in before. We use this word for animals. And it only became a word used for extraterrestrials when we began to get all the B movies in the States. And it was much easier to use a word alien than it was to use extraterrestrial. So yes. The whole use of the word alien is misunderstood by people today because it was never intended to mean extraterrestrials.
Interesting. We, of course, can mention at this point also the influence of the Bible in this case here then, because this is a conflicting story. Obviously, the way the Bible interprets this is that these guys were, evil. This is the snake that's associated with everything from Lucifer to Satan and the devil and all that stuff. And this has been put forward in this way. But what you're laying forth here is that this is a branch of highly intelligent, wise people who were trying to recreate order in society, and we of course, later on can tie this together also with the Garden of Eden, because there's obviously a very interesting connection here. But the influence of the Bible, just a short note on that. Do you think that has been helpful, so to speak, in discrediting this story?
No, it's been absolutely awful. I recently read a book called The Parthenon Code, and this is about the wonderful sculptures around the Acropolis in Athens. And Acropolis, on top of the Acropolis, you have the Parthenon built, and it was blown up by accident when the Turks were fighting somebody in that area. But the Greeks were in absolutely no doubt whatsoever that their gods were ancestors, real people, no doubt whatsoever. Mm. And they also knew that the serpent knowledge and the serpent system was benevolent, marvelous, good, important, in direct conflict to the Hebrew view of things. Mm. So it's very important to look at this big picture. We have a denigration of the old gods, which is very sad. The lady Ninkasag, for example, who is a single lady in the group who is married to Enlil and is the biologist who works with Enki in the lab and creates so many of our domesticated crops and animals, and also there is clearly the creation of man with advanced technology. And when we begin to look at the advanced technology, which we now know was used on our domesticated crops, which are quite different from our wild crops, and There was a one-stage process, and anybody who understands the science will have very little doubt that extraordinary skills were produced in creating something like 40, maybe 50 crops, and the technology being available in southern Lebanon at the start, and then eventually we find the same technology being used at much higher altitudes in South America and Mexico for different types of crops, which were ideally suited to those higher elevations.
Yes.
And so the agricultural record, the sophistication of irrigation, the use of terraces, the use of many different ways to conserve water extremely efficiently, all the things we need to be thinking about now is how we're going to feed the planet. All these technologies were there right from the start. And we find the terraces in Lebanon from the earliest times, the same in Peru, and there was a worldwide common knowledge and technology. And everybody will tell you that it arrived and was taken by the teachers and craftsmen who had come from the Lebanon. That's our starting point.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into a little bit later here much more about the farming, the origins of agriculture. The thing about the seeds is a fascinating story, and this is another scientific proof, if you will, that there is some kind of involvement here, some kind of genetic tampering going on here. But let's talk about the human being before we go in and talk about the agricultural. We have these people then, the Anunnaki. They might have been giants that lived on the earth before the catastrophe. They had knowledge that the catastrophe was coming and consequently were able to prepare in the best way they could. A few survived, but the question arises then, when did modern man, so to speak, pop up on the scene?
Well, I don't think there's any real difference between modern man and these people. As I say, we've got a common Y chromosome at 50,000 BC. I personally think that they had developed their own culture and life to very high standards. They had wonderful diets. They understood the dietary importances. They had been able to do what we can now do, which is extend lives by 50, 60 years, maybe a lot longer. And they also, I think, knew how to use their brains, and they had accumulated a tremendous amount of knowledge. And we see that their whole system within the city-states, with their trade guilds and with their taking enormous trouble to produce carpenters, masons, farmers, stockkeepers, shepherds, all the various trades and professions running up to 200, say, it was crucial that people kept that in the family. There were limitations on people marrying out of their crafts and trades.